Today, we are going to look at the most terrifying ends that Karens have ever faced. From a London social worker who chased graffiti vandals onto a rotting bridge, to a Chicago paralegal whose impatience with a broken elevator cost her everything. It was July 14th, 2016, in London, England. The sun set behind dense clouds that mirrored the rust and decay of the Blackwall overpass. Few pedestrians ventured there, and those who did kept to the safe edges. One woman, however, treated the bridge less like a hazard and more like a stage. Clara Benson, 37, worked part-time as a social worker, known in her East London neighborhood for outspoken campaigns against graffiti and vandalism. She had 2 children and often posted updates about local community issues on social media, combining advocacy with shared posts. Friends described her as persistent, sometimes reckless, believing her presence alone could stop wrongdoers. Clara had a fascination with documenting confrontations, carrying her smartphone everywhere, often live-streaming minor arguments to her small following. She also had a habit of ignoring physical warnings, cracked railings marked with "Do Not Enter" signs, believing she could navigate any environment with care. Her relationship with risk was inconsistent. She carried safety gear for work, wore practical shoes, yet often allowed anger or excitement to override caution. That night, Clara wore a sleeveless blouse and sandals, holding her phone in one hand while gesturing with the other. The bridge's temporary maintenance walkway, installed over steel beams, was clearly marked as closed to pedestrians and showed signs of rot and water damage. She had never crossed this section before, but the urge to confront vandals and record it outweighed reason. Clara had noticed 2 teenagers tagging graffiti along the walkway near the central span. She called out to them and began filming, her phone recording the interaction. The teens laughed and moved further along the walkway, stepping around rusted steel patches. Clara followed closely, stepping over a rusted barrier, gesturing and shouting. The teens later confirmed she leaned over a visibly rotted plank on the closed maintenance platform, about 10 feet away from them on safer ground. The wind was light but sufficient to sway the structure under her weight. She stepped forward onto a section of the temporary wooden walkway, weakened by water damage and rot. One of the teenagers froze, watching. The plank cracked audibly, the wooden panel bent under her weight, and she screamed as it gave way entirely. Clara plunged approximately 15 feet onto exposed steel beams below the maintenance walkway. The sound of metal striking metal echoed across the bridge, amplified by surrounding concrete. Bystanders ran to the edge, shouting and gesturing for her to stay still while they called for help. The teenagers froze for several seconds, then moved back to safer ground while bystanders alerted emergency services. Emergency services arrived within 6 minutes, with firefighters deploying ladders and harnesses to access the collapsed walkway, while medical responders prepared for extraction. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but massive blunt force trauma to her torso and lower limbs made survival impossible. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries to the chest and pelvis, with massive hemorrhage. Contributing factors included fall from height onto protruding steel beams on the rotted maintenance walkway. Structural inspection revealed widespread rot and corrosion in the closed section. Several days later, the teenagers turned themselves in to authorities. They were not charged in connection with Clara's death. Instead, they received minor penalties for graffiti and trespassing on the bridge. Clara's funeral was held quietly at a small East London chapel. Her 2 children were placed in the care of relatives, shielding them from the media and public attention. It was September 16, 2017, in Houston, Texas. The late afternoon air was hot and humid, carrying the faint chemical smell of fuel from nearby pumps. The neighborhood gas station was busy but calm. Vehicles lined at the pumps, attendants moving between tanks. Nothing suggested that a moment of frustration and recklessness would turn into a fatal incident. Marisol Vega, 42, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized Houston firm. She was organized and detail-oriented in her office, but outside, she was known for her quick temper and outspoken nature. A mother of 3, she often tried to balance family responsibilities, occasionally overestimating her control over situations. Marisol frequently posted complaints about local businesses on social media, sometimes getting into minor confrontations. Friends noted that she had little patience for perceived wrongdoing and often let indignation guide her actions, even when it contradicted common sense. At the gas station, Marisol pulled up in her four-door sedan, as she often did when running errands. She had a habit of multitasking, scrolling through her phone or juggling calls while she worked. That afternoon, dressed in casual office clothes, she stepped out with a half-smoked cigarette between her fingers, ignoring the prominent no-smoking signs posted at the pumps. The station's pumps were aging and prone to small fuel leaks, and vapors had pooled under her car and near the pump base, creating a highly flammable environment, though this was not immediately visible. Around 5:10 p.m., Marisol pulled her car into Pump 3, complaining to attendants about alleged price gouging. She left the engine running while gesturing angrily, escalating the argument. Attendants tried to explain the pricing structure, but she persisted, waving a cigarette in the air as a rhetorical device. Wind conditions were light, and unaware that gasoline vapors had still accumulated beneath her vehicle, she brought the cigarette close to the fumes. Witnesses reported that the moment she flicked the cigarette, a brief flash fire erupted, igniting the concentrated vapors around the base of the pump and under her car. Flames surged rapidly, scorching her and the immediate area. Security cameras captured a sudden flash fire enveloping the pump area, with rapid ignition of nearby fuel puddles. The sedan remained mostly stationary, though some panels melted and smoke billowed. Attendants and motorists scrambled, shouting, some attempting to throw extinguishers over the fire, but the intensity was immediate. Marisol suffered severe third-degree burns across her torso, arms, and legs. Smoke inhalation caused respiratory distress. The sedan's doors and nearby pavement caught fire from pooled fuel, and smoke made rescue difficult. All attendants could do was phone for emergency help. Paramedics arrived within 5 minutes, but noted that the combination of burns and inhalation of toxic gases rendered survival unlikely. She was pronounced dead en route to the hospital. Investigators confirmed that the cigarette had ignited concentrated gasoline vapors that had pooled beneath the vehicle, reaching flammable concentrations in a confined area near the pump nozzle. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as third-degree thermal burns and inhalation of toxic combustion gases, with minor blunt trauma from the surrounding environment. The fire department contained the blaze, and the station was closed for 2 weeks for inspection and safety retrofitting. Marisol's 3 children were staying with their grandmother when the accident occurred. The family held a small private funeral 3 days later. Their grandmother later said the hardest part was explaining to the children that their mother's impatience and disregard for safety had led to her death. It was February 3rd, 2018, in Calgary, Alberta. The morning began calm, the kind of winter day that seemed uneventful to anyone passing by the snow-coated condominium complex on 14th Street. By afternoon, frustration and ego would collide with physics, and a roof meant to hold nothing more than snow would become the site of a fatal mistake. Jessica Lane, 29, worked as an office administrator at a mid-size law firm downtown. Known by her co-workers for her precision and short temper, she disliked being dismissed or corrected, especially in public. At home, she'd earned a reputation among tenants and building staff as the one who files complaints. Her grievances weren't always baseless. Maintenance delays were common, but her delivery often escalated tension. She had recently started documenting what she saw as negligence, posting short clips online with captions about accountability and safety. She framed herself as a watchdog for residents. Though her methods often bordered on reckless self-assertion, Jessica was aware that the building's roof, built in the 1980s, wasn't designed for foot traffic, especially after heavy snow. The structure used wooden trusses reinforced by steel connectors, which could weaken when saturated with meltwater. Residents were told never to access it without authorization. Still, after seeing maintenance staff shovel portions earlier in the week, Jessica convinced herself it couldn't be that dangerous. Her stubbornness, mixed with a desire for validation online, blurred her judgment. That Saturday afternoon, she argued with the maintenance supervisor over an unresolved drainage issue that had caused leaks in the top-floor hallway. Frustrated by his deflection, She decided to prove how poorly maintained the roof really was. She retrieved her DSLR camera and declared to a small group of tenants that she would document the roof's current unsafe condition. The supervisor followed her to the back stairwell, warning her not to go up. She ignored him, citing her right as a resident. The roof was coated with compacted snow about 8 inches thick, concealing soft spots where moisture had warped the plywood sheathing. Her boots compressed the snow, masking subtle dips where the trusses had rotted. Wind gusts swept across the surface, pushing loose snow into ridges that obscured cracks beneath. Several neighbors leaned from their balconies, curious of what they thought would be another outburst. Jessica moved toward the middle section, where water drainage was worst. She crouched, balancing on her toes, and began taking photos. When the supervisor below shouted at her to back away, she waved him off and leaned farther forward, positioning her camera toward a patch of uneven snow. Witnesses reported hearing a muffled, sharp crack, the roof sheathing, and a truss cord fractured under her weight. She plunged through the plywood, attic framing, and insulation, falling into the concrete stairwell below. The impact was catastrophic. The 12-foot fall ended with Jessica striking the stairwell's edge and lower platform, sustaining severe head and chest injuries. Neighbors rushed inside after hearing the crash and found her semi-conscious amid broken wood and drifting snow from the ruptured ceiling. Paramedics, called by the supervisor, arrived within minutes, stabilizing her before rushing her to a nearby Calgary trauma hospital. She remained alive during transport and in the ER for a brief period before succumbing to internal bleeding and trauma to the lungs. The coroner's report cited blunt cranial trauma with multiple thoracic fractures leading to internal hemorrhage as the cause of death. Structural engineers later confirmed extensive internal rot in multiple roof trusses, worsened by repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Even a static load from standing was sufficient to cause failure. The breach measured 4 feet wide, consistent with eyewitness accounts, and debris scatter in the stairwell. The condominium board issued an immediate notice restricting roof access and began full structural repairs. Jessica's online posts were deleted at her family's request, and the roof was retrofitted with reinforced decking and new warning signage before reopening 3 weeks later. It was May 14, 2015, in downtown Chicago, Illinois. The morning air in the Loop was humid and tense, the kind that clings to everything and amplifies irritation. Inside the 30-story Marston Legal Center, a small mechanical fault had turned into a morning ritual, an elevator that froze between floors, testing everyone's patience. Naomi Foster, 45, had been a paralegal at a local firm for nearly 2 decades. She was meticulous, exacting, and known for her temper when systems failed. Her colleagues described her as efficient but brittle, the kind who thrived under pressure but could not tolerate delay. Divorced, with no children, her life revolved around work, precision, and control. She often stayed late to organize case files and prided herself on being indispensable. The small frustrations, slow printers, outdated computers, malfunctioning elevators were her enemies, reminders that the world didn't always move at her speed. The elevators in the building were older traction elevators installed in the late 1990s. They had a history of intermittent electrical faults, often stalling between floors or failing to close properly. Maintenance had been deferred for weeks due to cost disputes between building management and tenants. Signs had been posted advising occupants to use alternate elevators when malfunctions occurred. Still, Naomi insisted on using her usual one. She claimed she knew how to coax it back. To her, it was another problem to dominate. That morning, at 8:46 a.m., Naomi entered the south elevator on the lobby level with 2 co-workers. It jolted between the 3rd and 4th floors and came to a stop, leaving a slight door gap of approximately 2 to 3 inches. The lights flickered. A dull mechanical hum pulsed through the walls, while others waited calmly for assistance. Naomi pressed the emergency intercom and began berating building staff. Maintenance instructed them to stay still, explaining that power cycling would resume movement within minutes. She scoffed, muttering that she was not waiting another 10 minutes for incompetent idiots. Ignoring warnings, Naomi leaned over the partially open doors and extended her left hand into the narrow gap to inspect the car's edge. She used a metal pen to gently probe the seam, attempting what she called a sensor reset. because both the interlock and the door zone sensor were malfunctioning due to deferred maintenance. A system reboot triggered unexpectedly. Witnesses reported a grinding noise, followed by a sudden downward jerk. The elevator car moved while her hand was inside the doorway, crushing it against the outer frame in a manner consistent with partial avulsion rather than a clean sever. The impact damaged the humerus, tore muscle and artery, and blood poured rapidly, pooling along the floor and doors. She screamed once, before collapsing backward, her colleagues pulling her clear. They immediately called the receptionist to summon emergency services. Footage from the security camera showed the floor slick with blood within seconds. Naomi was briefly semi-conscious, her breathing rapid and shallow. Paramedics arrived within 4 minutes and applied a pressure tourniquet, later adding a second to fully control bleeding. Her blood pressure dropped en route to Northwestern Memorial. She went into cardiac arrest 12 minutes after arrival. Despite transfusions, she was pronounced dead at 9:31 a.m. The coroner listed the cause of death as traumatic crush and partial avulsion of the left arm, with severe vascular damage and blood loss, ruling it accidental due to hemorrhagic shock. The official accident investigation concluded that the elevator's safety relay had reset automatically after a short circuit, and the door, interlock, and door zone sensor had failed, allowing motion with the partially open door. Building management was cited for inadequate maintenance and lack of mechanical lockouts during malfunctions. In the aftermath, Naomi's co-workers were left with conflicted feelings. While some mourned her death, many quietly resented her, recalling her frequent outbursts, disregard for warnings, and tendency to escalate minor malfunctions. The firm issued a brief internal memo acknowledging her passing, but no public statement was made, and her desk was cleared with minimal fanfare. It was August 12, 2016, in central Dublin, Ireland. Inside a small downtown bistro, a routine dinner was about to turn fatal through a sequence of ordinary decisions amplified by momentary impatience. Fiona O'Connor, 34, worked as a freelance marketing consultant specializing in small business campaigns. She had built a reputation for being direct and uncompromising, traits that made her successful in negotiations but occasionally confrontational in social situations. Her schedule was demanding. Clients, such as local tech startups and boutique hotels, required rapid responses, and Fiona often juggled multiple projects while maintaining an active social life. Her work frequently involved documenting interactions, whether for case studies, client reports, or personal reference. Fiona carried a high-end smartphone capable of high-resolution photography and video, often using it to capture details she considered relevant for her campaigns. She was meticulous about maintaining evidence of service quality, believing that real-time visual records could prevent disputes or validate complaints. That evening, Fiona dined at a popular downtown bistro, expecting a routine meal. When her order arrived incorrectly, her frustration escalated. Waitstaff tried to correct the mistake, but Fiona's insistence on capturing the moment for documentation led her to step beyond normal boundaries. She moved a chair closer to the counter, intending to film the interaction from a better angle. The floor had been recently mopped and remained slick, a minor hazard overlooked amid the low lighting and busy dinner service. Despite subtle reminders from staff, Fiona ignored the risk, convinced her stance was necessary to achieve the documentation she sought. The bistro was moderately busy. Patrons glanced up from their tables, some uneasy at the escalating argument. Fiona shifted her weight onto the chair, phone in hand, angling it toward the counter. The chair slid forward on the wet tile, tipping as she leaned, and her head snapped into the sharp, stainless steel corner edge of the counter. Immediate chaos followed. The chair clattered across the floor, and bystanders rushed to her side. She was unconscious, bleeding heavily from a scalp laceration, which was distinct from her internal injuries. With blood pooling around the impact site, staff applied pressure to the wound and stabilized her head and neck while calling emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing the severity of her injuries. Fiona's cranial trauma was extensive. The force of the forward impact against the stainless steel edge had caused a basilar skull fracture, producing a rapid subdural hematoma and severe brain swelling. She remained unresponsive during transport. Hospital staff initiated emergency intervention, but the combination of intracranial hemorrhage and swelling was unsurvivable. The coroner later confirmed that the scalp laceration was separate from the fatal internal injury, listing blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death. The incident prompted immediate safety measures within the bistro. Anti-slip mats were installed near service areas, and additional signage warned of wet floors. Staff underwent refresher training for handling public confrontations with safety in mind. Fiona's professional circle noted the tragic loss, but co-workers privately questioned her impulsiveness and judgment under stress, reflecting unease about the risks she routinely took in pursuit of documentation. It was March 17, 2018, in the Ascent district of Barcelona, Spain. The afternoon streets were lively, but congested, a mixture of pedestrians, scooters, and tourist foot traffic. In the midst of this ordinary urban bustle, a confrontation was about to escalate into fatal violence, not through premeditation, but through a series of misjudged actions. Laura Briones, 28, worked as an insurance assistant at a mid-sized firm in central Barcelona. Friends said that she often expressed strong opinions on social issues and personal responsibility. Laura had grown up navigating the crowded streets of Barcelona, relying on awareness and quick decision-making to get through busy city life. Her personal interests included volunteering with local charities, though she maintained a critical, judgmental streak toward behaviors she considered irresponsible. Her independent streak and sense of moral certainty often led her to intervene in situations where she believed she could enforce accountability. Laura's daily routine involved navigating crowded urban streets. She carried her work bag and a smartphone, often multitasking between calls and street observations. Her familiarity with Barcelona's traffic patterns gave her confidence, but it also contributed to an underestimation of risks in unpredictable situations. She was accustomed to relying on visual cues, assessing people's movements, and anticipating hazards. But sudden, atypical events could override her calculated assumptions. On that afternoon, Laura noticed a man near a corner littering. Plausibly, in her perception, this was an affront to public order, and she decided to intervene. According to witnesses, she stepped off the curb into the street, attempting to block his path while gesturing sharply. Traffic moved slowly, but cars and scooters continued approaching. Pedestrians noticed the confrontation escalating, and shopkeepers in nearby storefronts observed her assertive stance. Laura's attention remained fixed on the man, leaving her unaware of the immediate danger posed by both her surroundings and his potential reactions. The man, reportedly homeless and with a history of mental illness, carried a small folding knife. When Laura stepped closer, he reacted defensively, lunging instinctively with the knife. Laura did not retreat and continued gesturing aggressively. Witnesses reported that within seconds, she had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen and chest, including punctures to her liver, lungs, and a major artery. Immediately afterward, the man fled down a side street, disappearing into the surrounding crowd. Bystanders rushed forward to help her, while others called emergency services, with several shouting at him to stop while others froze in shock. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Laura had suffered penetrating trauma to vital organs, including the liver, lungs, and major blood vessels. Despite immediate medical attention on site, exsanguination was rapid, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Coroner reports later confirmed multiple sharp force injuries to the thorax and abdomen, noting hemorrhaging as the primary cause of death. Police tracked the man through CCTV and eyewitness accounts, apprehending him the following day. He was charged with homicide, and legal proceedings began shortly afterward, highlighting the risks involved in confrontational public interventions. Laura's funeral was attended by family, colleagues, and a small circle of friends. Her mother, visibly angry and grief-stricken, criticized both the circumstances that led to Laura's death and what she perceived as her daughter's recklessness. The service remained solemn, with attendees reflecting on how a momentary decision escalated into a fatal outcome. It was December 5, 2018, deep in the quiet outskirts of Monroe County, Michigan, where the winter air pressed cold and heavy against the trees. At the end of a long, rutted gravel road sat two properties divided by a sagging fence. one belonging to a retired veteran seeking isolation, the other to a woman who had never learned to leave people alone. Deborah Miller, 51, had moved to the countryside 2 years earlier after selling her condo in the city. She told people she wanted peace and space, but in practice, she brought conflict wherever she went. In Monroe County, she clashed immediately with her nearest neighbor, a reclusive Vietnam veteran named Walter Briggs. She accused him of running machinery too late at night and once reported him to the county over an imagined zoning violation. Locals joked that Deborah treated rural living like a homeowners association board meeting. Her new lifestyle came with none of the structure she'd had in the city. She spent mornings posting pictures of her poodle, Daisy, and arguing with strangers on community pages about leash laws. The gravel road between her yard and Briggs's was poorly fenced, and the veteran had warned her multiple times to keep the dog contained. Still, Deborah dismissed him as paranoid. That December morning, when Daisy slipped under the fence and disappeared, Deborah likely didn't think. She reacted. She decided that her neighbor had done something to her dog. The temperature was just above freezing when she stomped down the gravel drive, shouting the dog's name. Briggs's property was marked by clear "no trespassing" signs, but Deborah ignored them, marching past an old pickup and onto the front porch. She began pounding on the door, her voice sharp and rising. Her words echoed across the trees, pulling Briggs from a medicated sleep inside. He had been prescribed sedatives to manage his night terrors, the kind that left him disoriented when startled. The security camera mounted above the porch later filled in the missing seconds. The door opens abruptly. Briggs, still in a faded t-shirt, holding a 12-gauge pump shotgun angled toward the ground. Deborah steps closer instead of retreating, pointing at him and shouting. She gestures wildly, stepping into his personal space. When Briggs raises the weapon slightly in warning, Deborah lunges forward, both hands out, either to shove it aside or grab it. The camera shows a scuffle, a blur of motion, a hand on the barrel, then a single blast. Deborah collapses instantly, the recoil throwing Briggs backward into the doorway. Briggs kneels beside her, shaking, trying to compress the wound as blood darkens the wood beneath them. Neighbors reported hearing his panicked calls for help. Deputies arrived within 15 minutes to find Briggs unarmed, sitting motionless beside her body. She had been struck in the upper chest. The wound was unsurvivable. The poodle was later found unharmed, wandering the tree line behind both properties. Investigators confirmed Briggs's weapon was legally owned and that Deborah had crossed onto his porch without consent. Witness statements and prior police reports documented her repeated harassment of Briggs over minor grievances. The sheriff's department ruled the incident self-defense, citing the circumstances and Deborah's aggressive behavior. In the weeks that followed, local residents placed new "no trespassing" signs at the end of their drives. The case was quietly closed, but news circulated as an example of how arrogance can turn fatal when mixed with fear and isolation. It was May 20th, 2017, a bright Saturday morning in San Marino, California, the kind of day that drew tourists and socialites alike to the manicured calm of the Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens. The museum staff had prepared for a full weekend of guided tours. No one expected that by noon, the Serenity would be replaced by sirens and a body bag. Patricia Lowell, 48, was the kind of person who turned every shared space into a stage. A well-dressed Pasadena socialite and habitual committee volunteer, she prided herself on bringing energy to events others called refined. She had married into money early, filling her empty hours with charity galas, interior design workshops, and a small lifestyle account that rarely reached beyond her social circle. On the morning of the 20th, she joined a friend for a docent-led tour at the Huntington's European Sculpture Gallery, a serene space lined with marbles and plaster casts on wooden plinths. The docent, a retired art historian, opened with a standard warning. The statues were old, delicate, and in some cases, reconstructed over fragile supports. Patricia rolled her eyes audibly. She whispered to her friend that if something was that breakable, it shouldn't be on display. When the group reached Diana the Huntress, a 19th century plaster reproduction of an 18th century French marble, Patricia saw her chance for attention. The docent gently reminded everyone not to cross the velvet barrier. Patricia ignored her, stepping over it with practiced entitlement. Security footage later showed her brushing off a warning hand from her friend. She leaned back against the figure, laughing, arm extended for a selfie. The plinth beneath the statue gave a quiet creak. A few visitors gasped. Patricia turned her head and, smirking, tapped the statue's hip as if to prove her point. The structure failed in seconds. The plinth tilted forward, and the top-heavy sculpture lurched. The reproduction, weighing roughly 300 to 400 pounds, slid off its base, its outstretched arm striking her shoulder before the torso slammed into her chest. The marble floor amplified the impact, a hollow, irreversible sound. Patricia went down instantly, pinned beneath the shattered remains. Dust clouded the air, and tourists screamed. One man tried to lift the figure, but the broken mass was too heavy. Staff initiated an emergency closure procedure while calling 911. Paramedics and firefighters from the San Marino Fire Department arrived within 7 minutes, but the injury was unsurvivable. The autopsy cited massive blunt force trauma and internal hemorrhage. Museum staff closed the gallery for weeks, and the damaged sculpture was moved into storage, its fragments too ruined to restore. The Huntington issued a brief statement acknowledging the tragedy and reinforcing its safety protocols. Her family's reaction was muted and divided. Her husband, a local businessman, refused media contact, leaving flowers at the museum gate in private. Her adult children reportedly argued about whether to mention the circumstances publicly. The eventual obituary cited a sudden accident without details. It was July 4th, 2015, on Coronado Beach in San Diego, California. Families crowded the shoreline for fireworks and barbecues. To most, it was a holiday afternoon, sun, noise, and celebration. But for Darla Hennepin, it was another day to assert control. Darla, 45, had lived in Coronado her entire life, divorced, childless, and financially comfortable from her late parents' estate. She filled her days with neighborhood watch meetings and complaint calls to the city. Locals described her as high-strung and combative, particularly when she deemed her peace was disturbed. She had fought every noise permit, every parking expansion, every drone license she could file against. Her habits were predictable. Each morning she staked out the same square of sand, bordered by windbreakers and coolers that formed a defensive perimeter. She owned a folding cart labeled "Private Property" in marker. The aluminum pole she used to mount her beach shade, a 10-foot telescoping rod, technically meant for flags or boat masts, was polished from constant handling. Darla liked tools that looked official, things that signaled authority. That illusion of control would fail her the instant she turned that pole from decoration into weaponry. That afternoon, the winds intensified. A freelance photographer, hired by a local tourism board, piloted a small drone over the beach to capture crowd footage. The craft hovered nearly 60 feet up, its faint buzz lost under laughter and surf. But Darla fixated on it. To her, it represented intrusion, proof that her space had been violated again. Witnesses later said she began muttering under her breath before storming toward the man's setup near the access road. He explained his credentials and FAA permit, but Darla dismissed him, calling him a creep and voyeur. After failing to get him to stop, she returned to her car, face flushed and determined. When she came back, she carried the aluminum pole. People nearby assumed she was adjusting her shade. Instead, she walked straight toward the descending drone. The photographer yelled for her to leave it alone, but she was already mid-sprint. Sand kicked up around her bare feet as she swung the pole overhead, missing the drone entirely. The effort unbalanced her stance. As she tried again, the tip of the pole arced upward, striking an overhead 12,000-volt distribution line running above the access road. The explosion was instantaneous. A burst of white-blue light engulfed her. The sound, a sharp crack followed by a low electrical hum, froze the crowd. Witnesses said her body stiffened mid-step, arms locked around the pole. For a moment, she seemed suspended, before collapsing to the sand. Several beachgoers hesitated, unsure if it was safe to touch her, before one man called emergency services and another cautiously began CPR. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Darla's hand showed deep burns where it had touched the pole, and parts of her clothing were singed. She wasn't breathing, and despite resuscitation attempts, she showed no response. She was declared dead on sight. Investigators found clear scorch marks leading from the contact point down through her sandals, the current exiting through damp sand. Electrical engineers later confirmed she'd struck a 12,000-volt distribution line, an almost certain instant death. In the days that followed, the city framed the event as a tragic accident during a crowded holiday. Safety reminders about power lines were added to beach access signs. Darla's family held a private cremation in La Jolla. Few attended. Neighbors left small flowers near the site, not from sympathy, but acknowledgement. It was January 28, 2018, at the Alpine Lodge and Spa in Aspen, Colorado. Inside the glass walls of the pool complex, only the hum of filtration pumps and the faint rippling of water broke the stillness. A 55-year-old guest, known among the staff for her relentless complaints, had finally found a moment where no one could tell her no. Monica Braithwaite came from money, but not warmth. Divorced twice, she split her time between real estate investments and luxury retreats, convinced her spending granted her special privilege. At every property she visited, she left a trail of incident reports, arguments with front desk staff, threats of online reviews, confrontations over non-existent service lapses. She demanded bottled water brands few hotels carried and often inspected sheets for microscopic imperfections. Her life revolved around control, and Aspen was supposed to be her winter refuge. The Alpine Lodge was designed for comfort at altitude. Sealed glass enclosures, automated heating, and natural gas systems calibrated for efficiency. The indoor-outdoor pool maintained a stable 82 degrees Fahrenheit through a thermostat-controlled heater in an adjacent service room. It was safe, modern, and unremarkable, unless someone tampered with it. Staff were trained never to exceed set parameters, since gas-based systems in thin mountain air could vent improperly. That restriction made sense to everyone except Monica, who saw it as defiance. That afternoon, she stormed out of the spa when told the pool was at temperature. Several witnesses overheard her muttering about lazy employees and cheap operations. The young attendant she confronted tried to remain polite, repeating that adjustments required management approval. When the general manager reinforced that policy, Monica left in icy silence, face taut with restrained fury. Security cameras later showed her returning just before midnight, wrapped in a white robe, slippers scraping against the tile. The service door was slightly ajar. Maintenance had left it unsecured after calibrating the filtration pump earlier that evening. Monica slipped through. Inside, the equipment room was humid and warm, lit by a single flickering fluorescent tube. She located the heater, an older but functional natural gas unit, and spotted the manual control valve. She twisted it with both hands, grunting as the metal resisted. When it finally gave way, she likely heard the faint roar of ignition. What she couldn't see was the small crack in the flue gasket, a fracture that allowed exhaust gases to leak directly into the closed air system. In the thin, low-oxygen air of Aspen, incomplete combustion worsened the buildup, creating a dense pocket of carbon monoxide near floor level. Over the next 15 minutes, carbon monoxide displaced breathable air. Monica reclined on a lounge chair beside the pool, satisfied with herself. Within minutes, the first symptoms, lightheadedness, confusion, would have begun. Witness reconstruction suggests she stood up, staggered toward the service door, then collapsed near the heater switch. The gas continued to build overnight. By morning, the concentration exceeded 1,800 to 2,000 parts per million. Levels fatal in under 2 minutes of exposure. At 7:42 a.m., the same attendant from the previous day discovered her lying on the tile floor. He immediately called emergency services. He reported finding a woman unresponsive near the spa pool, unsure if she was breathing. Within 5 minutes, paramedics and firefighters arrived, evacuating the building and beginning CPR. A portable gas detector went off as soon as they entered, so they put on full breathing gear and started airing out the building. Fire crews later measured dangerously high carbon monoxide levels throughout the facility before shutting down the system. The official cause: acute carbon monoxide poisoning. In the following weeks, the Braithwaite family filed a wrongful death suit alleging negligence. Investigators, however, found security footage confirming unauthorized entry. Records showed Monica had filed similar comfort complaints at 3 previous resorts. The hotel paid for a full ventilation overhaul costing more than $100,000. For a time, guests would still ask about the rumor of a woman found by the pool, but the questions dissipated over time. It was September 15th, 2016, at Wat Phra Sing in Chiang Mai, Thailand. The air was heavy with humidity, and rain from the morning monsoon clung to every polished surface. The temple's bells chimed softly in the distance as visitors moved quietly, sandals stacked neatly by the entrance. Amid the calm reverence, one foreign tourist was growing restless. Chloe Davenport, 39, tried to make her living on contrarian travel content. Her channel was built on disdain. She positioned herself as a truth teller, claiming to expose fake tourism experiences. In reality, her videos drew small audiences who watched more for the spectacle than the insight. Brands had stopped sponsoring her months before, citing unprofessional tone. Yet Chloe remained convinced she was on the verge of a breakout moment. She micromanaged her boyfriend, who doubled as cameraman, and berated locals when they didn't cooperate with them. Her reputation for confrontations had followed her through hostels across Southeast Asia. Temples like Wat Phra Sing, especially during the monsoon season, required care and awareness. The marble terraces became slick from condensation and tracked in rainwater. Signs warned visitors in multiple languages to remove shoes for safety and respect. Monks cleaned the floors frequently, keeping them pristine but dangerously polished when damp. Tour guides routinely reminded tourists to walk slowly, especially near the upper terrace steps. To most visitors, the rules were simple: tradition and caution intertwined. But to Chloe, they were just another obstacle to her content. That afternoon, she arrived under gray skies, complaining about the dreary light and the smell of incense. The temple's courtyard glistened under scattered droplets, and her boyfriend reminded her about the posted warnings. Chloe dismissed him, filming herself mocking the signs before a robed monk approached. Witnesses later recalled her loud, cutting tone as she argued that removing shoes was unsanitary. The monk remained calm, pointing again toward the rack by the gate. Finally, Chloe yanked off her sandals in exaggerated frustration. She stepped onto the terrace, phone angled upward, her bare soles slapping quickly against the wet marble as she moved without caution. Other tourists treaded carefully, some stopping to watch her perform. She moved fast, impatient, pacing backward for a wider shot and grumbling about stupid rules. Her boyfriend raised his arm in warning as she shifted weight onto her left foot. The instant it slipped, her balance broke completely. Her legs shot forward and her upper body snapped backward, striking the floor with audible force. The impact fractured the back of her skull and caused an immediate loss of consciousness. Momentum carried her toward the nearby staircase, where her head struck the first stone step before her body tumbled down several more. By the time she stopped at the bottom, her phone had skidded several feet away. Tourists rushed over. A monk knelt beside her, checking for breathing and pulse but not attempting to move her, while others shouted for help in Thai. Temple staff activated the local emergency line, and an ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics began CPR, but quickly determined that her injuries were incompatible with survival. A basilar skull fracture with cervical trauma, consistent with a high-energy fall onto stone. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The Thai authorities reviewed the footage and ruled the death accidental, citing unsafe conduct in a restricted area. The temple closed the terrace for 2 days to perform a cleansing ceremony and placed additional safety mats and signage afterward. Chloe's family released no public statement. Her online accounts were taken down upon their request. Among the travel community in Chiang Mai, her name became shorthand for what happens when arrogance meets gravity. It was November 3rd, 2017, at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Gate B-42. The storm outside was relentless. Inside, hundreds of grounded passengers sat in tense silence, faces lit by phones and flight boards that never changed. The atmosphere was heavy but resigned, except for one woman whose rising voice cut through the hum of exhaustion. Linda Ferguson, 50, was a senior operations manager for a mid-tier logistics firm based in Naperville. Her professional life was defined by control. She thrived on being the loudest presence in any room. Subordinates described her as demanding to the point of cruelty, and she carried that same energy everywhere. Restaurants, stores, and especially airports. She prided herself on her efficiency, but mistook impatience for competence. Her management style rewarded confrontation, and years of getting her way had eroded any filter between impulse and action. Travel had always been a stage for her worst behavior. O'Hare, with its chaos and delays, was the perfect storm for her temperament. She insisted on flying business class for domestic trips, considering it a sign of professional success. Her company covered the costs reluctantly, preferring to avoid the inevitable tantrums that came with denying her requests. On this particular trip, she was returning from a quarterly review meeting in Boston, already seething over the client's unrealistic expectations. When weather delays hit Chicago, grounding every outbound flight, she saw it not as an act of nature, but as a personal insult. By early evening, Gate B-42 had become a pressure cooker. The storm showed no sign of easing, and the gate agent, a young employee named Ben Alvarez, was fielding a line of frustrated passengers alone. When Linda reached the front, she demanded immediate rebooking, a hotel voucher, and an upgrade. Ben explained that due to the widespread cancellations, all accommodations were being processed by the system queue. Witnesses said her voice escalated with every word. She accused the airline of targeting her, then leaned over the counter, her face inches from Ben's, as the waiting area fell silent. Security footage later reconstructed what followed. When Ben attempted to type on his terminal, Linda snapped that he was making it harder than it needed to be. She came around the counter despite multiple warnings. In her frustration, she decided to prove how simple the task was. She grabbed the edge of a freestanding check-in kiosk, one of the older, portable units weighing nearly 300 pounds. It contained a built-in scale, computer, and bolted monitor, mounted on a metal bracket. The unit wasn't designed to be moved manually, but maintenance staff had recently unlocked its casters for cleaning earlier that evening. As she shoved it, the top-heavy frame shifted forward instantly. Security footage later confirmed she had bypassed the counter rope barrier and initiated contact with the machine before it toppled. The kiosk teetered for half a second before tipping completely. Several witnesses gasped as the monitor edge caught her across the temple, spinning her sideways. The full mass of the kiosk followed, crashing down with her beneath it. The monitor bracket and base struck her chest and skull simultaneously, producing a sharp, hollow crack that echoed through the terminal. Passengers froze in shock before screams erupted. Ben lunged forward, but the damage was immediate and catastrophic. Massive cranial trauma. No pulse. Paramedics responding to a call from the personnel arrived within minutes, finding her pinned under the twisted machine, lifeless. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and thorax. The force of the impact was equivalent to being struck by a small motorcycle. The airline issued a brief internal notice, citing a fatal accident involving passenger interference with gate equipment. Legal representatives reached a confidential settlement with the Ferguson family to prevent litigation. In the days after, Ben Alvarez was kept out of the terminal while investigators reviewed footage. Co-workers said he barely spoke, staying behind closed doors in the operations room until his shift ended. He filed an incident report, then requested transfer to a non-customer-facing role. He never returned to Gate B-42. It was February 7th, 2016, near Leadville, Colorado. The ski area had already started shutting down for the season, and only a few maintenance workers were still around. Two friends in their mid-20s, Evan Carter and Logan Price, arrived late in the afternoon. Evan worked short warehouse contracts during winter, while Logan filmed small outdoor clips for fun, hoping one day a video might gain traction online. They recorded each other walking past the half-empty parking lot, their breath showing in the cold air. Light was already slipping behind the ridge. Most lifts stood idle. A chain with a bright closed sign hung across the main access, and a rope barrier stretched across the loading area. They looked around, saw no staff nearby, and stepped over it. Logan lifted his phone toward the empty line, framing the shot like a final ride challenge before the mountain fully closed. They reached a chair hanging low enough to grab. Working together, they pulled it down and climbed on. The system, still powered for maintenance rotation, carried them uphill even though it was flagged offline. They filmed as they rose higher, the air getting colder. Below them, the slope was covered in rough, compacted snow, layered from repeated freeze cycles. Midway up, the chair shook and stopped. A metallic click echoed along the cable. Then silence followed. No engine hum, no motion. They waited, expecting someone to restart the line. Nothing moved. Cold wind pushed against the chair, making the cable groan. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the temperature fell sharply. After some time, Evan detached his phone from a small tripod and looked down the slope. He shifted forward and pushed himself over the front bar. He dropped around 22 feet, landing hard on a bank of frozen snow. A clear impact crack sounded across the slope. He rolled and clutched his leg. Blood began spreading across the surface, dark against the ice, coming from a deep fracture near his thigh. His phone, still recording, lay at an angle in the snow facing uphill. Logan stayed in the chair, calling down to him. Wind pushed the sound, but the audio captured his breathing turning quick and uneven. Evan tried to move, but lost strength, blood freezing in thin layers across the ground. Logan attempted to place an emergency call, but his phone battery failed in the cold before the call connected. The screen went black. Far down the slope, a snow groomer passed once. Its operator later stated he saw the lift was dark and assumed no one was riding it. He heard a distant voice, but dismissed it as sound carrying through the valley. Night had fully set in. Logan stayed seated, his body stiffening as frost formed across the chair. Evan lay on his side in the snow, arm tightened across his chest. The temperature continued to drop without interruption. At that elevation, night temperatures drop fast once the sun disappears, especially in February. By morning, maintenance workers inspecting the lift found Logan still upright in the chair, body coated in frost with his hands locked around the bar. Evan was found several yards downslope, partially frozen into the snow with a thin crust of ice where the blood had spread and hardened. Both were later confirmed to have died from a combination of hypothermia and blood loss. It was October 29th, 2017, in a small neighborhood in Pennsylvania. Houses were decorated for Halloween, and several residents had set up lawn displays for passing kids. Mark Halper, a 31-year-old hardware store clerk, had turned his front yard into a walk-through scare setup using plywood walls, orange lights, and fake blood. He had a habit of building props from leftover materials from his job, and this year he wanted something louder and more intense than his previous displays. For the final part of his setup, he planned to jump out from behind a wooden sheet while holding a chainsaw. Instead of using a gutted prop tool like the year before, he brought out a real gas-powered chainsaw from his garage. He had removed the chain guard earlier in the day, believing the exposed chain made it look more real than the plastic prop he used the year before. His girlfriend stood near the porch steps with a bucket of stage blood and a speaker playing looping screams to sell the effect. A group of teenagers had already gathered at the sidewalk, holding their phones up to record. Mark started his routine by pacing along the edge of his porch in an old latex mask and stained coveralls. The chainsaw engine roared as he pulled the cord, and the crowd reacted to the sound. He stepped down toward the yard, letting the engine idle loud enough to echo across the street. The ground was wet from light rain earlier that afternoon, and damp leaves from nearby trees were spread across the walkway. As he made his way forward for the jump scare moment, his foot slid on a cluster of slick leaves. The sudden shift in weight sent him off balance. The running chainsaw tilted inward toward his leg. With no guard in place, the exposed chain struck deep into the inside of his thigh. The contact was fast and forceful, cutting directly along the inner leg, where the femoral artery runs close to the surface. Blood immediately pushed through the costume fabric in high bursts. The bright red stains blended with the fake blood already splattered across the prop walls, making it look staged at first glance. A teenager recording from the sidewalk kept filming, zooming in, thinking it was part of the act. Mark dropped the chainsaw, but it remained running on the ground, the engine sputtering against the pavement and spraying small bits of leaf and fabric from the spinning chain. His girlfriend rushed toward him, recognizing the movement wasn't part of their rehearsal. She shouted for help, but several people near her hesitated, assuming it was part of the performance. Some laughed nervously, phones still raised. Mark collapsed onto the driveway, blood flowing rapidly down the slight slope and pooling near the edge where the pavement met the street. A neighbor across the road later stated she initially thought it was a clever, fake collapse until she saw the pool spreading wider than any store-bought prop could mimic. By then, someone had finally rushed in to kick the chainsaw aside and kneel next to him. A call was made for an ambulance, and a couple of people tried pressing on the wound using parts of his costume and prop fabric, but the bleeding was too strong to control. His body went limp during the attempts, and chest compressions were started on the pavement out of urgency rather than clear instructions. The chainsaw remained on its side nearby, engine still running weakly as the chain continued to turn in slow rotations against the wet pavement. When responders arrived minutes later, he showed no reaction. He was confirmed to have died at the scene from rapid blood loss after the chain cut through his femoral artery. It was April 12, 2015, on the outskirts of Newark, New Jersey. An old construction site sat behind a rusted fence, partly overgrown with weeds and littered with scattered concrete slabs. A 19-year-old community college student named Kyle Mercer, known among a small circle of local skaters for filming night clips in urban locations, entered the area with two friends after dark. They looked for new spots to film tricks under the streetlights that flickered across the property. They slipped through a bent section of fence and walked along the unfinished pavement. One of them taped a phone to a metal rail using black electrical tape, angling it to catch a grind attempt. The phone's flashlight was left on, casting a narrow beam across a stretch of cracked concrete. Near the edge of the frame, a dark trench cut across the ground. From above, it looked like a shallow dip filled with rainwater, reflecting a faint glimmer from the streetlight. Kyle stepped back for speed while the others moved beside the rail. The camera's light reflected off the wet surface, flattening the depth and making the opening appear shallow. With enough momentum for a jump, he pushed off his board and aimed to clear the gap. Instead of hitting solid ground, he dropped straight down. The trench was actually a vertical utility shaft, leading to a drainage access tunnel roughly 25 feet below the surface. The sound of his board clattering against the concrete edge, followed by a heavy impact, echoed upward. The audio captured a sharp thud as his body struck the lower landing. His legs folded awkwardly, and the phone taped to the rail caught only the top edge of the shaft and the sudden jolt of his board flipping out of frame. His friends rushed to the edge, looking down through the darkness. They could hear shallow gasps from below, but saw little beyond the faint light of his fallen board's small LED. They argued about calling for help, worried about being caught trespassing on a restricted site. Minutes passed with no clear decision, until one of them tried climbing down using metal rungs embedded in the wall of the shaft. A night security guard patrolling a nearby lot later reported hearing the sound of metal hitting concrete along with distant voices, but he believed it was just scavengers moving through the area for scrap. He did not approach the site. By the time one of the friends reached the bottom, Kyle was slumped against a lower step built into the shaft wall, breathing in short, uneven bursts. The other two hesitated at the top, still unsure whether to involve emergency services. His breathing slowed and eventually stopped while they remained in the shaft, unsure what to do next. They backed out before dawn, leaving the phone still taped to the rail and the board lying near the edge. When maintenance crews arrived in the morning for routine inspection, They found Kyle positioned upright against the concrete step, his body partially twisted from the fall. The phone above continued recording until its battery died sometime during the night. He was later confirmed to have died from impact trauma and untreated injuries sustained in the fall. It was December 3, 2018, in a frozen parking lot outside a bar near Duluth, Minnesota. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s, and a thin crust of ice covered the pavement. Snowbanks from earlier plowing lined the edges of the lot, some piled higher than the parked cars. Ryan Keller, a 28-year-old office worker, had attended a small reunion gathering inside. By around 2 a.m., most of the group had dispersed, scraping frost from their windshields and idling their cars before heading out. Ryan made his way to his sedan parked near the back edge of the lot, where a snowbank had been pushed up nearly level with his rear bumper. Instead of leaving, he got inside and started the engine to let the heater run. The exhaust pipe was pressed close to the packed snow, partially sealing the outlet without fully covering it. As the heater circulated warm air, condensation began to fog the windshield from the inside, spreading in uneven streaks across the glass. From outside, only shifting patterns of moisture were visible across the windows. With the cabin sealed shut and the heater running, exhaust trapped by the snowbank began to gather underneath the vehicle, feeding carbon monoxide back into the ventilation system through gaps in the floor and ducting. The gas built up inside the cabin without any odor or visible sign. Carbon monoxide gradually replaced oxygen in the enclosed space, based on how CO exposure progresses in confined environments. Ryan would have lost awareness within minutes as the level in the bloodstream increased. Around 3:15 a.m., another group left the bar and crossed the lot. They noticed Ryan's car still idling with its taillights on and windows fogged over. Seeing no movement through the frost-covered glass, they assumed he was letting the heater run before driving home and continued walking. As the night continued, the thin film of condensation on the interior windows cooled and began to freeze. Frost formed along the edges of the windshield and slowly expanded inward, making the glass appear hazy and opaque. The muffled idle of the engine could still be heard near the back of the lot, dulled further by the packed snow around the exhaust. By 4 a.m., the car appeared no different from any other vehicle left running to stay warm in freezing conditions. Interior visibility was almost fully obscured by frost. Carbon monoxide continued to accumulate inside, while fresh air never entered the sealed cabin. At some point, all movement inside the car stopped. The engine continued running for hours. Without body heat, the interior temperature dropped again, causing frost to spread until most of the windows were coated in a pale layer of ice. From a distance, the car looked like someone had simply fallen asleep while waiting for the cabin to warm up. Around sunrise, a staff member from the bar stepped outside to check the lot before leaving. Ryan's car was still idling in the same place, the windows sealed with frost. When the staff member went closer and looked through the glass, he saw Ryan slumped in the driver's seat, unresponsive. The door was open, but there was no reaction. He had already died from carbon monoxide exposure caused by exhaust blockage and gas buildup inside the sealed vehicle. It was July 9, 2016, in Bakersfield, California, where weekend heat pressed down on quiet residential streets. In one of the backyards, a temporary filming setup had been arranged using foldable camping tables, 2 tripods, and a used industrial water tank positioned in the center of the lawn. The stunt was planned by Luke Carter, a 24-year-old amateur performer who had been posting small magic tricks online in hopes of gaining an audience. His previous uploads showed minor escape attempts using ropes and plastic cuffs, but this was his first time involving a fully enclosed water tank. The tank had originally been designed for agricultural storage and still had faded manufacturer markings on its base. Luke had cleaned it earlier in the afternoon and drilled a small air hole near the cap, saying it would prevent a pressure lock. The hose water inside remained slightly cloudy from residual tank dust. 2 friends, both familiar with his videos but not trained in rescue or stunt coordination, were assigned to operate the cameras. They stood on opposite sides of the yard to capture 2 angles for a future edit. The setup looked informal, with no safety mats, medical supplies, or backup tools apart from a basic toolbox left open on the ground. Before climbing the ladder, Luke cuffed his hands in front of him using a pair of metal restraint cuffs and secured his wrists further with thick zip ties. He planned to snap the ties underwater as a show of strength and then push upward against the lid for a dramatic exit. The lid was not designed for rapid removal and had a rubber lining meant to seal against liquid leaks when used for farm chemicals. The friends noted that it sat tighter than expected during a quick test, but no further adjustments were made. The tank was filled to the top, causing the surface tension to press directly against the lid once it was set in place. Luke lowered himself into the water, submerging until his head disappeared and only a few air bubbles drifted up. The lid was placed, and it shifted slightly, creating a full seal. The drilled air hole was immediately overwhelmed by a thin layer of water clinging to the cap's surface, blocking airflow completely. Inside the tank, the temperature drop and sudden pressure change caused Luke to twist his shoulders and attempt to press upward. The movement produced rapid bursts of bubbles that struck the lid in short, rhythmic pulses. From outside, it appeared like an intense performance moment meant to heighten drama. His legs kicked against the base, sending vibrations through the plastic. The friends continued recording, adjusting their camera angles rather than assisting. They later described the knocking sound as sharp and metallic due to echo inside the tank structure. A neighbor watering plants adjacent to the fence heard the impacts, but assumed someone was playing a diving game in a pool. The water inside the tank began to settle as the movements became less forceful. Only small ripples remained at the surface, spreading out and fading in seconds. When several long moments passed without any further movement, one of the friends finally stepped forward and tried to lift the lid. The suction held it firmly in place. He called to the other camera operator to help, and both pulled against the top, their hands slipping on the wet plastic. They located the screwdriver in the open toolbox and wedged it into the seam, forcing air to rush in with a hollow pop. The lid came free suddenly, and water sloshed over the sides. Luke's body drifted upward until his shoulders broke the surface. His face was pale, eyes partially open, and his arms floated outward with no resistance. One friend jumped into the tank water and hauled him out awkwardly over the edge, dropping him onto the grass. His chest showed no visible movement. Basic chest compressions were attempted on the uneven lawn without checking for a pulse. The compressions caused water to expel from his mouth in short bursts. Emergency services were called several minutes after the tank was opened. Paramedics arrived and continued resuscitation efforts using proper airway tools and a portable oxygen unit. Luke was transported to a nearby hospital, where staff continued attempts to restore a heartbeat. Despite multiple cycles of CPR and assisted ventilation, no cardiac activity returned. He was officially pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The tank remained in the backyard, still half filled, with cameras left running until their batteries drained. The water inside was still and clear, showing no signs of disturbance after the final struggle ended. It was October 31st, 2017, in a residential suburb of Salem, Oregon. Most houses had front yard displays set up for trick-or-treating, and plastic decorations lined the sidewalks. In one yard, a full-sized wooden coffin stood out from the rest of the displays. It belonged to Mark Ellison, a 34-year-old grocery store employee known among co-workers for building homemade props each year. He had told a co-worker, Daniel Reeves, that he would be setting up something worth seeing and that Daniel could stop by the next morning before their shift to check it out in daylight. Mark had spent several nights building the coffin from plywood, reinforcing the lid with metal brackets and reusing an old latch taken from a storage trunk. The latch was automatic and clicked shut once the lid was lowered. A Bluetooth speaker, hidden near the porch, played looping haunted audio tracks, including faint knocking sounds and dragging noises. A bowl of candy sat on top of the coffin to draw kids closer before the planned jump scare. Mark entered the coffin at dusk, to be in place before visitors arrived, and pulled the lid shut. The latch locked, sealing the interior. No ventilation holes were drilled, and the wood fit tightly at the seams, restricting airflow. Investigators later noted scrape marks on the interior of the lid and sides, suggesting he attempted to force it open from inside. The limited air volume inside the coffin, combined with rising carbon dioxide, would have caused rapid breathlessness in the confined space. Early signs of distress likely included increased breathing rate and physical agitation, leading to repeated impacts against the lid. The coffin's audio effects masked the thudding sounds, and passing visitors assumed the vibrations were part of the display. A neighbor later reported hearing dull tapping but dismissed it, believing it came from the speaker system. As the night went on and foot traffic slowed, no one approached the coffin closely. The speaker battery eventually drained, silencing the background noise. The yard grew quiet, and the coffin remained in place without movement. The scrape marks and pressure marks on the interior walls indicated that the last attempts to escape were made with weakening force. Oxygen depletion in sealed spaces of that size can lead to unconsciousness within minutes, especially with elevated carbon dioxide levels contributing to air hunger. By early morning, light frost formed over neighborhood lawns. A neighbor taking down decorations noticed that Mark's display looked unchanged, but assumed he had left it in place intentionally. A garbage collection crew moved along the street shortly after and shifted plastic props closer to the curb for easier pickup. One worker placed a hand on the coffin to slide it aside, but left it when he felt the unexpected weight for something meant to be hollow. Around 8 a.m., Daniel Reeves stopped by as planned, expecting to see Mark outside collecting decorations before leaving for their grocery shift. Most Halloween setups on the street had already been taken down or moved, but Mark's yard remained untouched. The coffin was still sealed shut, standing exactly as it had the previous night. Daniel went to the front door first and knocked several times. He waited, then tried again. There was no movement inside the house. He called Mark's phone, and a faint ringtone sounded from somewhere in the yard instead of inside the house. Following the sound, he found the phone lying face down in the grass near the coffin, partially covered by damp leaves. The screen was still active, showing multiple missed calls. With no sign of Mark elsewhere on the property, Daniel returned to the coffin, now treating it as more than just a prop. He placed a hand on the lid, expecting it to shift like a lightweight display piece, but the latch resisted. The lid felt sealed tight, and a thin layer of moisture along the edge suggested it had not been opened since nightfall. The weight distribution was also off, heavier toward the head section, unlike an empty prop. Daniel stepped back and contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived and used a pry tool to force the latch open. When the lid gave way, a rush of cold interior air escaped. Mark was inside, positioned against the lid, with dried scrape patterns visible on the inner wood near arm height. He was lifted out and assessed on the lawn. Rigor mortis had already begun, and no signs of breathing or pulse were present. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The coffin stayed in place while investigators photographed the latch, scrape marks, and interior surfaces. The drained speaker was found in the bushes nearby, its battery fully expended. Once documentation was complete, the display was dismantled, leaving only a flattened imprint in the grass where it had stood during the night. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.